And welcome to Tulane University. It's our pleasure to introduce our next session, Availing Tax Credits and Grants to Finance Renewable Energy Projects. If time allows, at the end of the session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. To submit a question, just simply scan the QR code located on the screens. Please be sure to silence your cell phones. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Please join me in a warm welcome to our moderator, Anu Varadharajan, KPMG.
Good afternoon. It's a beautiful day, and thank you for joining us on this conversation about availing tax credits and grants to further renewable energy projects. We've had, I think over the last 2 days, a lot of conversations about the wonderful work that is happening within Louisiana, and I'm joined today by two great guests for this conversation as well. So my name is Anu Varadharajan. I am a director with KPMG LLP, a Big Four accounting firm, and I work in exclusively sustainable tax services. So helping firms, higher education, not-for-profit, the entire gamut, understand how to take advantage of federal, state, local incentives, grants, and credits to further renewable energy projects, because as we have heard over the last couple of days, these projects sound great. They are very necessary for society, but they're also ridiculously expensive. So how can we get some financing to help propel our journey forward? I also used to be a professor at Tulane before I went to KPMG, and I taught tax at the Freeman Business School. So this is great to be back on campus and see a lot of familiar faces and just imbibe the energy here. So I'm joined today by Sophia Winston, who is the Energy Policy and Program Manager for the Office of Resilience and Sustainability at the City of New Orleans, and Matt Hart, Investor Relations at Churchill Stateside. Sophia, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Sophia Winston. I'm the Energy Policy and Program Manager with the Office of Resilience and Sustainability here in the City of New Orleans. I've been in this role just under a year and a half. My background is in city planning, but I kind of transitioned into energy policy by getting thrown into it head first. I came here from Philadelphia, where I was managing the city's energy benchmarking program, so doing a lot of data management analysis around building performance. And that led me to this current role in the City of New Orleans, where we are currently trying to pass an energy benchmarking ordinance, but my role entails so many other things, including developing microgrids, partnering with local organizations, trying to get the word out kind of in more of like a grassroots style around all the tax credits that are available at the residential level, and just being part of like the City of New Orleans efforts to take part in this just and clean energy transition. That's kind of where I see myself right now. So yeah, a little bit about me.
Fantastic. Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Anu. And it's a little intimidating to be here with a former tax professor, considering I spend most of my time on the phone with tax directors of Fortune 500 companies, bringing them into the renewable space. Oftentimes they're driven not only by the sustainability aspects, but the tax savings and the other incentives and benefits that come along that are purely financial. So we work with them. We've done about $6 billion in tax equity financing, probably the most active in the market behind the bulge brackets. We're a registered broker-dealer, investment banker, along with full-scale fund management and asset management to allow the Fortune 500, large insurance companies, large banks, to facilitate these projects through what's often 9-figure checks for financing.
No, I'm actually impressed that you get tax directors to the conversation and to the table as early as you do. Oftentimes the challenge that we face when we're advising clients about renewable energy is it's driven by the sustainability team, and tax is often not at the table as early as we would like to. So kudos on you getting the tax team up front. So before we dive into discussing how the investor perspective and the city perspective of taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, I just want to take a few minutes to level set on what is the Inflation Reduction Act. I know that there's quite a bit of familiarity with respect to the alphabet soup of credits that is available within the IRA, and my fellow tax geeks would be thrilled to rattle off, is it a 45Q, V, W, X, Y, and Z, the entire alphabet. But when it was passed, it brought nearly $1 trillion to the table to provide funding for renewable energy project. I mean, we had not seen a tax act of that size before the Inflation Reduction Act came to pass. And it addressed familiar technologies like wind and solar, but it also paved the way for new technologies to be funded through these tax credits, like clean hydrogen. Our last panel was talking about turquoise hydrogen as well. So think about clean hydrogen and the plethora of that, nuclear energy and how that can be leveraged. I think the next panel after this is talking about fusion, not fission. So you've got, and then you have the semiconductor industry being covered by this. You have carbon capture and sequestration, which is huge for the state of Louisiana. We are a carbon hub. And we're also a hydrogen hub. So you've got a plethora of energy efforts that were funded under the Inflation Reduction Act. So the base credit, right, when we talk about you get a credit, it's really saying how much money did you spend on this project? And the base credit is 6%. Spend $100, you get $6 back as a tax credit from the federal government. Not to stop with that, they understood that these renewable energy projects had the capacity to really change the workforce and make a social impact. So they added a few social components to the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. If you were to hire and pay prevailing wages and use apprenticeship as part of the construction and installation of these renewable energy projects, your credit went from 6 to 30%. That's a great way to ensure that as you are installing these renewable energy projects, you're also taking care of the workforce that is coming to work on these projects, right? So making sure that you follow the Davis-Bacon Act and pay prevailing wages. They also instituted a 10% bonus for domestic content, ensuring that other factors or other areas of the U.S. economy got to participate in these renewable energy projects. So if you used U.S. steel, U.S. sourced iron, you got an additional 10%. So we've gone from 6 to 30 to 40. And if your projects happen to be located in energy communities, we had a session again on the justice around clean energy, you got another 10%. So now you're looking at up to 50% with respect to tax credits that you could get back. So I wanted us to take a step back and say, this was an all-around effort to bring several areas of energy as well as society to move along in the same direction. So, and then they also made some provisions for tax-exempt organizations, so universities and then academic medical centers to also benefit from this, which was completely new and was not part of tax credits prior. And I think the last, really, Matt and I think it's earth-shattering, was transferability. If you had these tax credits and you couldn't take advantage of them because you didn't have tax liabilities, you could turn around and sell it to somebody else. Now, naturally, there are lots of rules and all of that, but that's sort of the sandbox that we can play in when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act and taking advantage of these tax credits to fund renewable energy projects. So we're going to get two very different perspectives here from Matt, who works with investors investing in renewable energy projects, and Sophia, who's talking to us about how the city of New Orleans, a local government municipality, is also able to take advantage of these renewable credits, and what does the journey look like. So Matt, I'm going to start with you. Before the IRA provisions, how would you evaluate projects? And how have investment decisions changed when you factor in IRA tax provisions?
Yeah, sure. So it's pretty seismic. So before it was a very complicated Byzantine structure from a tax standpoint, but it was very simple in what technologies were eligible and which credits they were eligible for. So solar projects were eligible for the ITC, the investment tax credit, which is a cost-based tax credit, where you take that cost and then have a fair market value based around what was largely based around that cost and go out, claim your credit from the federal government. Wind projects were the only other eligible technology. Winds were based on a PTC, a production tax credit, that was based on the actual kilowatts or megawatts produced at the meter, and were often just paid quarterly in arrears. So there were two relatively simple structures, each with their own technology. With the advent of the IRA, we saw not only eligibility for both ITC and PTC for multiple technologies, the cost or the production method, but in addition, we saw an expansion through nuclear, biogas, digesters, hydrogen fuel cells. I'm leaving a lot off here, but
Battery storage.
yeah, batteries. So we actually did the first battery deal in the industry at Churchill. It was a $130 million deal. The Rio Grande, about a total project cost was about $250 million, but I can't believe I left off batteries. But yeah, as you can tell, it's a laundry list. So what that did, at least from an investor standpoint for us, it opened up a whole lot of investors. So you used to get a lot of quick no's. So you'd call and say, hey, do you like saving money on taxes? Yes. Do you like saving the environment? Yes. Would you be willing to do this complicated Byzantine structure where we're going to have to get it signed off all the way up to your CFO? And no. With transferability, which is the biggest portion of it, that opened up a lot of investors who were no longer, or were previously not interested due to what were often gap geography issues on their income statement of how the credits and the pass-through depreciation were going to be accounted for. So not only were we looking at, okay, what type of credit do you want? What technology do you want that will affect yield? But also, do you want transfers or do you want traditional tax equity? Because you're going to get two different return profiles, which may match your, treasury goals for your corporation.
Very cool. So you mentioned that solar and wind were traditional, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned a whole bunch of others like batteries. Is there one that is sort of spearheading, front runner, other than solar and wind?
Oh, yeah. For what's come along, well, first off, 45X manufacturing credits have become very, very popular. It's a nice way for the very large corporations, think your, Fortune 50, 50 largest corporate taxpayers in the country, to really knock off a base load of credits. Those are the ones where if you're engaging in advanced manufacturing of renewables materials, you are able to get a credit for that. What we've found is that they, number one, the underwriting on them is pretty smooth. You know what's coming. Everything's sort of audited and accounted for. Number two, just the numbers have gotten really high, so that's a really popular one. Nuclear PTCs are going to be coming down the pipeline, but really I think battery technology is the one that's the true game changer from a sustainability standpoint. No matter how green your glasses are, renewables, wind and solar, are an intermittent source of power. So unlike a nuclear plant where you put in the fuel rod and run it for 6 months and it's producing the same amount of electricity the entire time, solar peaks, 1 to 3 p.m. every day and then goes down. Wind is, big in the morning, big at night, but you're never going to have 24 hours. So one of the most interesting things about batteries is, not only are we starting to see leaps, and it's not like Moore's Law level leaps, but leaps in the actual technology of how long they can sustain power for, but we're also starting to see them play a big role in evening out what's called the duck curve, where you have lots of power being produced in the middle of the day, which drives down energy prices. And then there's still a lot of energy demand from 4 to 7 p.m., 4 to 8 p.m. at night that needs to be accounted for. Batteries are doing a great job of pulling down that power when power is cheap, putting it out there when power is expensive, and really allowing the proliferation of solar and other intermittent sources that people didn't previously think was possible.
So I would say the battery is definitely going to become a critical component of energy storage as we explore new ways of generating, because you need to be able to store it to use it on demand,
Exactly.
like Netflix. Sophia, let's turn over to what the city is doing here. So the city of New Orleans has released a report to be net zero by 2050. And if you in the audience have not read it, it's fascinating. And I'm so happy as a transplant, but still somebody who's lived in the city for the last 10 years, really thrilled to see that we're going to be undertaking efforts to become greener. How important were the Inflation Reduction Act credits provisions in coming up with that plan? If you could share some insight, that'd be great.
Yeah, so this most recent iteration of the Climate Action Plan was released at the end of 2022. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act had both passed at that time. But it wasn't until like a little later after the plan was actually released that these tax credits and all the grants that are kind of becoming like our signature, like impactful grants that we have currently weren't released until later, until like 2023. So in our climate action plan, for example, we have the goal of installing 1,400 solar panel systems on homes by 2030 through our Solar for All NOLA program, which currently is basically just like a promotional program. We promote Solar for All, we partner with local solar developers, and then basically if folks are interested, they pursue the solar panel on their own financing, basically. That's a huge goal. That's about what we estimate being around 10 megawatts of distributed energy resources. Mm-hmm. And we know that solar is a really big investment for the everyday household. Even if the tax credits are there, a household might not be able to make the upfront payments, or they might not want to go through like a leasing model. So while we don't necessarily, we have the tax credits available for those that are interested in them at the residential level, having the opportunity to apply to different grants that were available through the IRA, specifically in this case, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. Mm-hmm. Now we're able to give $5,000 subsidies to 1,400 households across New Orleans. So, I mean, that's really how we see we're going to meet this goal, is by providing this cash up front and partnering with local developers, bringing in new developers mm-hmm. into the region because of this subsidy. And we're really hoping to also layer it with Solar for Y'all funding, which was also made available through the Solar for All funding through the EPA. So, I mean, even without thinking about how the tax credits play into all these different economies of scale, like the ability to apply for all these different grants related to different sustainability and resilience initiatives has been a huge game changer in our office. And it's been able to help us fund basically our entire climate action plan. And then, you know, similarly, the city has invested in electric vehicles and being able to take advantage of the direct payment on that. So far is going to yield around $75,000 because we invested in 10 electric vehicles, one of them, which I parked over there, if anyone wants to take a look later on. But yeah, I think even without the credits being kind of front and center when this plan was produced, having them available, having all the grants that became available kind of like brought life into our plan and are making things a reality. So it's super exciting for us.
So in other words, is it fair to say that without these Inflation Reduction Act, the spend on the city would be significantly more, which ultimately would have been borne by taxpayers?
Yes, I think, for example, like the residential solar, I don't know of a way we would have met that goal at the current numbers we're going at mm-hmm. without these provisions. And obviously the 30% tax credit to homeowners is great, but that doesn't capture renters or people who wouldn't have been able to afford it up front otherwise. So it's going to be a huge game changer.
Fantastic. How has the decision-making process changed with respect to the IRA tax provisions? I mean, when you were deciding, do we go with a, solar or, EVs or other factors that you have in place, what is the decision-making process like?
Yeah, I think we're lucky in the sense that we're operating off of our climate action plan. So we have a really clear strategy laid out in front of us. So it's just a matter of like aligning funding where it makes sense. But for example, I believe in 2022, the city, or 2023, the city began spending some of its own funding, the Wisner funds, on local organizations, specifically Together New Orleans and Get Lit, Stay Lit. And we knew that that was a solid investment because we're seeding them money to create microgrids at congregations and community centers as well as restaurants. But they can then go and take that money and get direct pay because they're 501c3s. So not only is our dollars are going farther, but we also feel like they have a little bit more agility in terms of like contracting with different developers and doing things really quickly. It always takes a lot of time at the city level. So I think knowing that there's that direct pay incentive to these local organizations is a huge, like we want to be able to give folks this money because we know that money is going to be multiplied and it's going to be spent locally.
So you brought into the conversation the contractors and others who are going to be involved in it. How has their willingness to work on these projects before IRA versus having the Inflation Reduction Act at your disposal, has that changed the landscape at all?
Yeah, I think that has definitely changed the landscape. We, at the same time that the IRA provisions and the tax credits are happening, we're also navigating a new like community solar policy landscape. So previously, community solar was not being one-to-one net metered. So that basically meant the developers were not going to turn a profit if they invested in community solar in New Orleans. And once we changed those rules and made it one-to-one, we also added a 2-cent per kilowatt bonus for any low to moderate income subscriber. Immediately the community solar queue was full. But I think with that also goes if a community solar developer is a nonprofit or partners with the nonprofit, depending on where they site that community solar project, they're at a minimum going to earn, I believe 40% because we're an energy community. But if they're in a low income community, then they're up to 50. And then, again, you can meet 70%. So in different areas, like that's community solar isn't necessarily something that our office is controlling. It's something our office advocates for and wants to see more of, but knowing that there's a financial return for folks at multiple different levels is great. And we saw that change overnight, basically.
Fantastic. Matt, I wanted to ask you, can you share some situations where like a deal was sort of revived from the dead because the IRA came? 6 months ago, that was done, dead in the water, the numbers didn't pencil out, and then with the Inflation Reduction Act coming through, you're like, well, there you go. Now we can make it work.
Yeah, no, I mean, generally at the scale of projects that we're doing, the $250 million to $500 million range, it will have to pencil out very early. But what you will see is there are maps of every, transmission line in the country where, injection studies have been done on many of them, and the exact capacity at those points. The easiest place to build a renewable project is where a former, call it coal plant that, probably had a 30-year original life and has just been, put together with chewing gum and Band-Aids or whatever to keep extending its life for 5 years. Well, all of a sudden, if you can use that existing point of interconnection that used to maybe carry 200 megawatts and put in a fresh renewable project with a 30 to 40-year life, that's the ideal spot. That's not most of the spots that are out there. So all of the other spots along the transmission lines have some inflection point of whether or not it makes sense to build a power plant there. So those maps, became very important because as you started crunching the numbers on what does this 10% adder mean here, what does 20% adders mean if we go through, get the full 30% credit, which nearly everyone's doing, how does that affect it? And so it opened up a tremendous amount of opportunity for power plant developers to be able to go out and truly fill out our nation's grid in a manner that was most efficient. And one thing to note about that too, unlike traditional power plants that run off of a feedstock, whether it's natural gas for a gas plant or coal for a coal plant, What you see for most of the traditional forms of renewable energy is a very high upfront capital expenditure and then very low operating expenses going on in the future. So the ability to sort of subsidize the upfront cost, I think, just opened up a world of potential based on what you're looking for your net present value for your payoff.
Super. Are funds flowing where the greatest need is? So we talked a lot about, energy communities that need to benefit from renewable energy. I know that's something that's important to Louisiana, but it's not something that's just exclusive to our state. But in your experience, Matt, as in national investments, and then definitely Sophia, where you're seeing the activity within the city and the state itself, I'm curious to see where you've seen the greatest benefit of the Inflation Reduction Act credits.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our climate action plan, we have a lot of goals around the green economy and the green workforce, but those goals always kind of seemed intangible because there's so much good work happening in New Orleans, but there was never a lot of funding around it. I mean, we've partnered with LA Green Corps and a couple of other local nonprofits that focus on workforce development and have some sort of green component to it. But now, the Justice 40 provisions, as well as most of the grants that you apply for have to have some sort of workforce component.
Mm-hmm.
How is this grant going to impact the community? How is it going to build workforce? What's the pipeline? How are you thinking that through? So I think just even taking the time to think about the workers that we need, the skills that we're going to need. And we see it in all the different areas that I work on in my day to day. From we need more HVAC techs, we need more folks that are proficient in energy efficiency upgrades. We need more folks that can just go through to your house and do an energy smart assessment, give you basic weatherization tips. But we also need folks who are going to go out onto the windmills in the Gulf and do maintenance and transitioning folks from oil rigs to windmills. We see that here. We've seen new programs about wind technology emerging. So I mean, for us, it just seems like the workforce element has just cracked open, and that is going to have a huge impact on the economy. And we're really excited to see where that takes us. Every time we have a grant, we're talking to local workforce people to see how they can fit into that. And it's definitely top of mind for us and something that is going to take time to see, but I think the benefits will be really impactful for this region specifically.
Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of driving investment to Louisiana, it's been fantastic. So the key component of that is really the energy community adder. So just to sort of get everyone up to date with what that was, Senator Manchin was the swing vote on getting the IRA done, and he was very interested in, making sure that areas that looked like his constituents in West Virginia weren't getting left out of the renewables revolution. And so what he did was design this concept where you got a 10% bonus adder if your census tract had a certain amount, Metro MSA had a certain amount of energy employment within the last 10 years, and then also was below the nationwide average for employment or unemployment stats in the negative. So as you can imagine, Louisiana has a lot of those energy communities, and it has driven a significant amount of renewables investment here that you'll be seeing it. A lot of these projects take, at a minimum 3 or 4 years, but often longer. You'll be seeing a lot of that come online. There's a big project over in Hancock County, Mississippi, that's coming online right now, projects in North Louisiana, and then I'm sure all of the projects you guys have been hearing about from the hydrogen standpoint during this conference.
And we're also going to get lots of solar, right? I know
So those were the solar projects I was referring to. And,
yep.
Pretty much every day I get a book across my desk from some New York banker, and the name of the project is Zydeco or Acadiana, and so I know right away it's coming up in Louisiana in 26 or 27 or further down the road.
Yeah, and I also saw the Louisiana Illuminator, I think was yesterday, had an article that there's renewed interest in putting in windmills in the Gulf as well, that had initially kind of fizzled out, but it's gotten another revival now as much. Okay, so looking to the future, what are some challenges that you see within the Inflation Reduction Act space with respect to the IRA?
I left this blank in my notes because I think it's still such a new, everything that's in the IRA is still so new, and people are still like figuring out how to take advantage of it. And I think projects are really right now coming to a point where there's a lot of people coming to the table and have ideas about what they want to do and how they can use their direct pay and how they can make, how they can stretch their dollars, quite frankly. So, I mean, you know, the future is TBD, and we're going to see how things go. But I know, at least for our office and the funds we control, we have $49.9 million thanks to the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. And we want to, you know, get started right away and give these solar subsidies out, pass our ordinances, get our e-bike rebates out the door. And, you know, whether or not that becomes popular in the future or, you know, we want to do that work locally because I think that's where it's really going to make a difference.
And there are universities, right? I think you're working with Dillard University and Xavier University, which are traditional HBCUs that are located in energy communities to foster some of these initiatives. And it really then brings these benefits to the grassroots and the census tracts and the people that really need to benefit from them. So I think it's fabulous. If you look in the looking glass, what are some challenges for the IRA?
Oh, well, it was originally passed on partisan lines. So since that time, about 83% of the total dollars have flown into, have wound up in red congressional districts. So I think it will be, there was a group of 18 Republican congressmen pre-election, so this could change with the new dynamic, who signed that they wanted to take it on with a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. And that's generally what I'm hearing as well. You know, I'm in Houston regularly, not only because there's a large corporate tax base there, but also a lot of energy experts. They are thrilled with a lot of the provisions of the IRA, especially the fuel components. But most of the oil majors at this point also own their own, they purchase their own solar and wind developers. And so what I would say is that, you know, I started my career when it was Trump in the White House, I started my career in tax credits way before. I closed my first renewables deal when it was Trump in the White House and a Republican House and Senate. And the credits were around then. I've closed deals when the credits were significantly less than what they are now. So if it's true that they sort of go after it with a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer, I don't think folks have that much to worry about. The other key component is that because the credits are earned on the placed in service year, there are very, very tight rules that are very clear around when a project has commenced in construction and when the first electrons technically start flowing. So because of that, there are a lot of opportunities to safe harbor projects that have already gotten the green light, may or may not even have bank financing yet. But if you can go and spend 5% of your total CapEx getting transformers and other things to prepare that can often be used for another project, you can go ahead and safe harbor projects now.
So I agree. I think there's definitely a push to try and get as much done as possible for this calendar year, depending on, you know, how they use the scalpel to figure out what the Inflation Reduction Act provisions could change. I mean, the genie is not going back in the bottle, so these provisions are around. And we don't expect, there may be changes, you never know with the new administration what they would like to do, but we definitely expect it to be prospective. So maybe in January there may be some new rules. I do know that final regulations have been stopped. So they issued I think the last one to come out last week was the ones with semiconductors for the CHIPS Act and the critical advanced manufacturing for 45X, but no more. So we expected, for the alphabet soup guys, we expected 45V to come out this year and then 45Z, 45W possibly, but all of that is not happening. So waiting and seeing. But I think the one aspect that I don't expect to go away is transferability. And it's a wonderful mechanism where if you are the generator of the credit, so you've gone ahead and installed a $100 million solar farm and you qualified for 50% of the credit, you're going to get $50 million back. So if you're not familiar with the way it works, you have to file the tax return to the IRS. They'll review the return and say, okay, yes, this looks good, and then send you the refund that you've claimed for the $50 million. That takes time, right? There's a lag between you installing it, filing the return, getting the checks back. Instead, you could go to a taxpayer that owes money to the IRS and says, I'll sell you my tax credit. It's transferable, and it's a deal that two people agree to. There are some caveats that make it interesting because it's buyer beware, you could get audited after the fact, et cetera, et cetera. But it circumvents if you think about the flow of money, taxpayer sending money to the IRS, the credit generator asking for a refund from the IRS, and sort of the IRS is the bank or holding. And it's a lot of time, that 18 months to 2 years that could happen between money changing hands. Instead, if you go to the private market and you're able to transfer the credits right away, that's money in the bank today. So it's a private market that's definitely booming. And because of the way that the credits and the timing and the rules work, I think the 2024 credits, even some of the 25 credits, are spoken for, especially if it's production credits, et cetera, et cetera. So I expect that to be an active market going forward. So we're down to the last 10 minutes, and I wanted to open it up to the audience for questions. And I think we have Kyle's at the back with some questions. Go for it, Kyle.
We do. Most of the questions have kind of, what you all just touched on, just kind of future looking. We've heard from a lot of the panels and sessions previously, last couple of days, but looking to get your insights about possible changes to the IRA tax credits and how you're navigating the uncertainty surrounding these these incentives around renewable energy products. Are there any of the tax credits that you think are at risk being cut, or do you share some optimism of any drastic changes to not occur?
I'm happy to take that one. So pre-IRA, there was a 30% ITC that had stepped down to 26%, I believe, for that final year. It was going to 22% and then was stepping down to 10%. The idea was that as panels became more and more efficiently created in, China or wherever, this was the previous legislation pre-COVID, that they would it would make sense to phase down the subsidy. What occurred then is, once the IRA came along, there were a lot of other goals that were put in. Energy independence was a very key goal. If we can manufacture what we need here to produce energy, we are in a better situation, and that's something worth subsidizing beyond just the climate aspects of it. I think, the domestic content adder has the ability to, should have the ability to be very popular on a bipartisan basis. I know locally First Solar is going to be building a big facility in New Iberia, Louisiana, that Louisiana will directly benefit from. There are other parts, though, it was so robust that, parts of it could be cut away. Maybe some of the fat could be cut away without touching the muscle. But all of that, remains to be seen. I think from our standpoint, we were doing a lot of deals and funding large deals prior to the IRA, and we anticipate that we'll continue to be doing it in whatever post-IRA or modified IRA environment exists.
Sophia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of feel like our obligation is to tell people what is actually happening in the federal government, and it can be very confusing for folks to navigate these different tax credits. And different states have gone after like the rebate model as well, which the IRA also made available. There's the tax credits and the rebates available for purchasing different appliances and different upgrades to your homes. And I think what we're focusing on now is we have this goal to kind of create this green energy campaign where we'll teach folks more about all these different incentives that are available, all these different programs that are available, whether that's locally or federally. And I think something we're just thinking about is, well, what are we actually going to talk to people about? Is it going to be the tax credits that are available for purchasing heat pumps or purchasing solar panels, purchasing electric vehicles? Or is it going to be the rebates? And we're not sure as of right now whether the state will pursue the rebate program. I know it's gone through in a couple of different states, most notably like New York State, Wisconsin has just launched a program. And I know that those are big programs to undertake, and that's a huge lift. And we would love to see that, but I think the future of that is unclear. So for now, just like making sure that folks understand how they can take advantage of the tax credits right now as they stand is kind of our top priority, and something we're hoping to launch on like a larger scale and to reach more people next year.
Yep.
So we'll be keeping an eye on whatever changes are made so that we can correctly dispel that information to folks so that they can take advantage and know what is available to them.
Fair enough. I'll sort of close it out with this. The COP is happening right now in Azerbaijan, and I was watching Squawk Box one morning a couple of days ago, and the CEO of ExxonMobil was on, and they asked him, right, with this new administration, what do you think is going to happen to these credits? And he was very open and honest and said, a lot of their investment in billions and billions, maybe $20 billion of investment within the renewable energy space has credits factored in as a significant source of financing and funding. So when leaders are, it's definitely going to be significant, and decisions are being made having factored in these sorts of financing capabilities and opportunities. So if they were to make changes to the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it will be done with a lot of consideration and finesse, using a scalpel, to determine which areas, if any, should come under review, and if they want to take decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for tax folks, it's going to be interesting. We'll see what the future holds. But regardless to say, I think having the Inflation Reduction Act has been a game changer in propelling sustainable efforts in the renewable journey. And if we take a step back to see how far we've come with respect to the availability of these funds and where the projects have gone and how society has benefited and will continue to benefit, I think it's definitely going to be a significant impact for the better for our society. So, any other questions?
Yeah, I think we might have time for one more question before closing statements. How do you ensure entities abide by the labor standards required to receive the credits?
Yeah, sure. So you're asking about the prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards. So there was a safe harbor put in place for projects that had already started construction. As I mentioned before, there's a 5 additional safe harbor where if you go out and buy equipment for 5%, you're safe harbored in. So the deals that we've been closing to date and will probably through Q1 are largely safe harbored from prevailing wage and apprenticeship. But after that, all of them are required to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. What that is prevailing wage is, it's well known in the Northeast and the Midwest and Union states, but a calculation as to what an appropriate wage is for different jobs on the job site. And then apprenticeship will require that 15% of the work be done by apprentices, not just sitting there watching, but actually working, putting panels in place. What we've seen is that a number of different accounting firms, and I'm not sure if KPMG is doing this as well, have set up agreed upon procedures known as AUPs that are agreed to in advance. Everything is tracked along the construction cycle. We're almost always signing up right as construction starts for the initial small financing. So our investors are along for that ride the entire way. And if there was a foot fault or a foot fault that could not be cured on the prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards, that would cause the credit to drop from 30% to 6%. So we would hope to get in front of that, ameliorate it. If it could not be, then we're in a position where we're not stroking a check for credits that hadn't been earned.
There's a lot of governance that needs to go in, oversight. So when we work with clients, we have a team that will be able to look at the contracts that you would draft up with a subcontractor or your vendor to say, do you abide by the prevailing wage requirements? And then how do you make sure that the data is collected? You have to have specific data for the workers that are doing the, whether it's installation, and there are very specific jobs that would be covered by the Davis-Bacon Act. And so making sure that you collect all the data, making sure that you are paying them at the appropriate cadence, identifying what the prevailing wage, every county has a prevailing wage dollar amount for every type of labor. So you need to make sure that your subcontractor has access to all of the data and they are following all the requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll give you an example. We are working with a client with a significant credit, and we have a team that's there every 2 weeks reviewing their prevailing wage documentation, making sure that there are no footfalls, and if there's anything that they're cured right away, because at those dollar values, going from 30% to 6% will be catastrophic. So yes, it requires a lot of diligence on everybody's part to make sure that the requirements are met. And when it comes to transferability, I'll just add this before I wrap up, it's buyer beware. So if you want to transfer your credits and you're claiming these, that you're meeting prevailing wage requirements, those documentations have to be spot on, and that's part of the due diligence that folks will undertake, or get insurance to cover those tax credits, et cetera. So it's a significant piece of it. And hey, when tax people get together and have fun, time flies. So we're at time. Thank you so much for joining me at this panel. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Matt, for coming and sharing your insights as well. And thank you for being a great audience.
Thank you.